So last week we talked about Sport 2.0, so new forms of products and services that came about because of digitalization or alongside digitalization. So the whole digital revolution or digital transformations, they brought changes to sport like in various ways and to various actors in the sport industry. So like for us, users or amateur athletes, we have now an abundance of data. We have wearable devices that we spoke about. We watched that video. So that changed the way we consume sport. Or think us of fans. So how digitalization changed the way that we watch sports nowadays. Most likely that we watch through media channels rather than we go live. And I even like put a tweet on my Twitter like these days that like Man City is creating or like building the first football stadium in the metaverse. So that gonna change the experience of watching football or like going to a football match? Very much like what I wrote on that blog post that you read as well about the future of sport. But today, what I want to focus is more about gaming and esports. So maybe that's like the direction where the industry is going. So maybe the evolution or like the changes that the digitalization brought is that there is a new sport emerging, which is esports. So maybe like first we need to understand the difference between gaming and esports. The notion that gaming is what we as non-professional athletes do. So when I turn my PS4 and play FIFA or UFC or Call of Duty, whatever, like I'm gaming. Or when I play Wardo, I'm gaming. So that's like more in the play part. But if you go like 2 weeks back, when I started like about the difference between play and work and how things are becoming like very difficult to differentiate one from another, we can like lead to the discussion of esports. So like esports, it's a professional activity. We have athletes, esport athletes. We have like teams, we have sponsors, we have leagues, we have like international federations. So that is to some extent the esportization or sportization of video games. So very similar to how pastimes in the past in the 1800s became sports. Now we see the same thing with video games. So like video games are becoming esports. So we can like trace like parallels between those two industries or two activities. So we are still using Andy Mia's book on Sport 2.0, and he talks about esports and gaming. And one of the points he makes, and then for me is like very telling here, is the notion of one, how big sponsors and very established brands are going into esports. So we see like a more acceptance of esports as a proper sport, as a proper industry, or maybe a subset of industry within sports. But also how there are different ways of watching, of consuming esports that are very unique to that industry. So again, we can think maybe esports as part of sports, or maybe we can think them as separate. They are very similar, they share similarities, but they have differences. And differences not only in the way that we consume, or we play, or we engage with, but also how it is monetized. So how is the business model behind esports? So traditional sports, we have like the traditional media model, which buy rights, and then they are like right owners, like right holders, and then they're gonna broadcast to a specific audience, which you pay for access. While on esports, we have like a more, let's say, open environment where those events are broadcasted on like open platforms that people can watch for free. But then the monetization happens in the different ways. And I'm going to talk more about this towards the end of the module, like new business models that come about because of digitalization, or because of those new media platforms that we're going to discuss later as well. So maybe here, when esports are able to bypass television, is where we get in difficulties, where you have very established business model environment with like sports, traditional media outlets owning the rights to broadcast that, to sell to that attention. And then you have new entrants, like new businesses, new sports, like as esports, new platforms, and very different business models. So are television networks willing to lose that attention? Go back a week ago where I talk about NBC's power in changing the Olympic program, or trying to change the Olympic program during the Rio Olympics. So is NBC going to allow esports to come in if they don't have esports in their portfolio? So how much they have as a power to say to the IOC that, well, we shouldn't have esports because that's something different. We don't want to associate ourselves with esports. So maybe here is like a little bit of the discussion that we can make on that video that I shared for you to watch. And I put like that question: are we going to see esports on the Olympic Games? So it's not only a decision, like if it is sport or if it's not sport, but also there is like a business decision behind. Are we willing to accept others in our closed group here? Or are we going to co-opt that group? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. So how I have organized the lecture: a little bit of the introduction from like gaming to esports, and how like the industry is moving in our direction, and the relationship to sport. Then we can look at, in broad, very broad terms, what is the business of esports, and how this business is being seen by the media and trade media. So is it considered a viable industry, or is that considered as like a bet in the future? And then forms of culturally consuming esports. So that's more or less like what I want to discuss today in the lecture. So still in line with that discussion on digitalization and what digitalization meant to the whole sports industry, is that it, to some extent, it broke the barriers, and broke the barriers between all users. So participants, athletes, athletes now are more able to engage directly with their fans. So if I'm an athlete, I have an Instagram account, I can like connect directly to the fans. And in the same way, fans can connect directly to athletes. So there is a more democratic space for everyone, or like so-called democratic space for all to engage to each other. But at the same time, it brought the experience of professional sport to amateur athletes. So amateur athletes can compare themselves with professional athletes. Let's say when they go and cycle on those events on Swift. So some of those Swift events, they have like professional triathletes, or like professional cyclists, or mountain bikers, like racing there, or like cycling together. And then you can like compare yourself. You can see like, what is your average power compared to a professional athlete? Or on Strava, you can go on Strava and you can see how you relate to other amateur athletes, semi-professional athletes, but also real top professional athletes who have like cycled the same routes as you, or have run the same routes as you, if you're like looking into running on Strava. So to some extent, this space is more democratic. It brought people together. And that's only possible because of this notion of the quantification. So wearable devices that we discussed last week is based on the idea that we can quantify everything. So you can quantify how many steps you made in the morning or like in the afternoon, during the day, your heart rate, resting heart rate, like how fast you run and so on and so forth. So that is a big change that digitalization brought. So like all aspects, everything can be quantified, everything can become zeros and ones, everything can become datafied, and of course, digitally uh, stored. But what another aspect of digitalization that we haven't taught much, but we touched upon a little bit, is the notion of miniaturization, in the sense that things are becoming smaller. So think in the past, maybe we could quantify those things. We could quantify how fast you go, like what's your heart rate, but that had to happen inside. So you need to have like a treadmill or like a bike. Now you can do that outside. So the experience of quantification is expanded because of those digital technologies. And when you have all those two things together, our experience is becoming even more gamified. So Strava for me is a perfect example of gamification. So Strava becomes a game that is played apart. So we don't need to cycle together, we don't need to run together, but you have like the leaderboards, you have like challenge that you need to achieve, you have like some branded challenge. So again, another change. So like brands are sponsoring through Strava. So our whole experience is being gamified. It's like becoming a game, a video game, but that's played with our own bodies. So maybe that's the argument that Mia's made, is that it makes sense to look at esports as a measure for the future. So esports as an aspect of gaming, and if sports are becoming even more similar to gaming, so let's look at esports, see what they're doing, and think that maybe that is the future of sports. So here is just an example on Strava, and there's like a segment just like behind my house here in Euclid that you can see like how many people have attempted, how many attempts. You can see like all the stats about that small segment here, the climb, the calf climb. I can see like my stats, how fast I did. But for me, what's interesting is this aspect here that brings, let's say, professional athletes close together to, I don't call myself amateur athlete, not even an athlete, like someone that likes to cycle. So that's Greg Van Avermaet, who was the Olympic champion in Rio 2016. So I can compare his speed, his time in that same segment that I did. So that was like impossible if I wasn't a professional athlete. And the way I see here, for the ones that are into video games and maybe you have played Mario Kart, that's like very similar to that Mario Kart when you play Mario Kart and then you do your PR, like your best time, and then you play against that ghost that's like that's your fastest time. So here I'm kind of competing against Greg Van Avermaet, but not at the same time. I know his time. I can try to beat him. I can like train to beat him, which would be like beating the Olympic champion or like past Olympic champion. So that's like gamification, that's miniaturization, that's digitalization in all in one picture. So the history and then how that came about, we can like trace back to the whole arcade culture and gaming, like Atari, like Nintendo, like all those games that maybe you're parents' generation played or like I played. But there was always this kind of like a negative feeling or a negative outlook towards gaming, especially to the idea of psychological harm. So how much harm this gaming, this new culture, or like this life on the screen can cause to young individuals. And this becomes like even exacerbated by the omnipresence or like the proliferation of mobile technology. So maybe in the past, like my generation, we had like one video game which was in the living room or in my room, and then you play, and then it's like somehow a little bit social. So you have like others next to you playing, or like next to you like watching you play. Nowadays we have like mobile tech, and then you're playing on your phone in a room, close, without anyone around you. And then there's like huge debates about how that can like isolate individuals, and then psychological harm, or people are like becoming like sedentary. They're not going outside, they're not playing, they're not running, they're not engaging with sport. But maybe most commonly discussed point is on violence. So are those like games making people more violent? So they are to some extent a simulation of war, or they are a simulation of shooting someone, killing someone, and so on and so forth. Does that make people violent, make them lonely, like all negative aspects? So like gaming has like a very, it had a very negative connotation, and maybe that is like carry out uh, through like the evolution or the changes into esports. So during like these times, during those 20 years, or even more or less, depending how we want to look, those preconceived notions, especially the ones that associated with violence, with like isolation, with like sedentarism, is being challenged by new forms of gaming and new forms of esports, or especially esports in general. So we can like look at platforms, how they challenge this, and look at Nintendo Wii, which is like a great example. So it brought the video game to the living room again. So it was a family thing. So people would play with others. Two, it was active. So people had like to make the movements. So you're not like just sitting there, moving your fingers and playing. So there was like an active physical movement that tried to challenge this preconception that is sedentarism, is not actual activity. You're not engaging in anything. And it's really interesting this point, because if you go and watch that TED talk that I put for you to watch today, that's one of the points that that person made, that those individuals, those athletes, they are top level athletes. It might not look like, because they are seated and they are like competing in a seated position, and they might be like just moving their thumbs and playing, or like maybe all their digits. But actually that involves lots of mental skills and lots of like physical skills and dexterity in your fingers to perform at that high level. Is not for anyone, is not for everyone. Is very few that can do that. So there is this challenge to those preconceived notions in order to build legitimacy. So that's the whole point behind esports becoming seen as sports, or do they need to be seen as sports to gain that legitimacy? In one way, we can see legitimacy through the eyes of sponsoring. So if mainstream brands, and not brands that are very niche, very small, that are very just like connected to esports, let's say the developers, Riot Games or EA Sports, are organizing, paying, sponsoring, or like having teams, it means that those brands and those people working on those brands see that as a possible industry? Or is that an industry so mature enough that they are willing to associate their names with that event, with that activity or that athlete, and so on and so forth? But also legitimacy in terms of becoming organizational, like becoming institutionalized in the organizational level. So again, the TED Talk talks about that, and then he uses the same example of that international federation, the International eSports Federation. So that's like a way of like being seen as other sports federations that, yeah, you are organized like us. So you are one of us. So that's like in terms of what the industry is facing is one, moving from those negative narratives to more positive narratives and to gain legitimacy, to gain a position uh, within the ones that we accept as sports. So here you can like see just like two examples, and then you have like Riot Games, and then you have like also like Overwatch League, and who are the sponsors? So you have like Louis Vuitton here, you have like Mastercard, you have like Red Bull, you have Coca-Cola, very established brands. For Red Bull, I would say maybe it's like a new brand, but it's very established nowadays already. Or new entrants like Spotify going into that esports direction as well, not only on the sports direction, but esports direction. So that's a show of legitimacy, a show that this is an actual industry that's worth investing. So what I did, I went to that International Esports Federation and I want to see like how many members they had. And then in the video, he said like 20 something members, if I'm not mistaken, but there are more than 100 now. So like from that video that he recorded or like that TED talk he gave to today or like yesterday or like a few days ago that I prepared the lecture, there it has grown. It's become like more legitimized. But for me, I was like, okay, I'm interested in Brazil. Of course, I'm Brazilian. Like, is Brazil on the list? Yeah, Brazil was on the list. So there is a Brazilian Confederation of Electronic Sports, of esports. But for me, it was really interesting to see here that one, they are certified by the Minister of Sport. So it's recognized as a confederation, a proper confederation, as football is, volleyball is, cycling is, and so on and so forth. But here is really interesting because they say that values such as Olympics, social inclusion, education, blah, 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 is being used through esports. But their association with Olympics and this idea that they need to be seen or they need to be present in the Olympic movement is that maybe the level of gaining full legitimacy for any sports. And it was interesting to see that the Brazilian National Federation had this here on their website. And that doesn't stop there. So like if they want to be seen as a proper sport, as a proper industry, they need to operate as such. And you know that sports and the Olympic movement, especially the IOC, the Paralympic movement, they all signed to the WADA uh, charter, so the World Anti-Doping Agency. And the International Esports Federation is also part of WADA. So there are doping allegations, there are doping investigations, there are doping uh, products, very similar to what other sports have. And it's interesting that the International Esports Federation signed into WADA a few years before the UFC, so the Ultimate Fighter Championship, signed into USADA, which is like the US version of the World Anti-Doping Agency. So to some extent, there is anti-doping in esports before we see on an established sport as MMA and in one particular promotion, which is UFC. So is esports more sports than UFC? Maybe institutionally, we can argue that it was. Now they are in the same, maybe same level. But while they get legitimacy and they are seen as a proper industry, the largest events, they're still non-sport events. So esports competitions, the big ones, they're normally either League of Legends, LOL, or on Dota. You have like also Counter-Strike, you have like Overwatch, as I show you, you have World of Warcraft, and so on and so forth. So those are the main events in esports. You have like Fortnite as well with like Ninja and so on and so forth. So those are the main events. And maybe here is the thing that the IOC and was like the president said of the IOC that violent games won't be seen in the Olympic program. So if we are gonna see esports in the future in the Olympic program, in the esports the way that we understand esports, maybe it won't be those ones here that are the key in that industry. And that might be an issue. So if all the users, all the audience are used to watching League of Legends, Dota, Overwatch, Fortnite, and so on and so forth, are they going to tune in to watch Madden, or are they going to tune in to watch FIFA? So there is a discussion. Is it worth to put something that won't be any audience there? The International Esports Federation tried to be recognized by the IOC, tried to be part of this global association of international federations. It was an invited member for a few years, but at the moment it is not. So maybe we can think that there is a whole power relation here operating where, let's pick the international cycling like UCI. Are they willing to give swift competitions to this association here? So the virtual British Cycling Championship, are they want them to be under this organization or under their organization? So the UCI is organizing Swift competitions. Or FIA, the Federation of International Car Racing, Automobilism. So are they willing to have car races on under this umbrella or under their umbrella? So there's like a power relation here operating, sponsorship, money, and so on and so forth. And the last point is, are athletes, are esports players, or are esport athletes really athletes? So lots of what is said on that TED talk was to try to show them as proper athletes. So to gain legitimacy again. Nevertheless, most likely what we're gonna see is that the economic argument is gonna trump everything else. So if there are sponsors willing to pay for, if there are broadcasters willing to pay for, and there is audience that are willing to watch, that will make esports into the Olympic Games or to any mainstream space. So it is a money decision, is the business logic, is the media logic that we spoke last week. Maybe, I don't know, do you know who this person is? Well, probably here there's like the answer. So here maybe shows like a little bit of legitimacy to esport athletes. So Ninja, which technically apparently is not one of the best Fortnite players around there. He's like a great streamer, he's a great entertainer, a good player. But Ninja was the first esports athlete to feature in the cover page of ESPN magazine. So you have a mainstream media giving legitimacy to a gamer. And you can even see how they frame their cover with all the symbols that if you play video games, you recognize from your controller. So again, speaking the language of that audience, of that public. And I don't know if you were aware, but like during Tokyo 2020 or like Tokyo 2021, we saw the Olympic virtual series. So there were esports events, and then different from LOL, Fortnite, Overwatch, League of Legends, and other like games. It was played on, let's say, cycling. Like it was a Swift competition. Rowing, it was like in a rowing machine. Then you have motorsport, so like car racing with like simulators and so on and so forth. So it did happen already, and we did have an Olympic event on esports. And if we go to the Olympic agenda 2020 plus 5, and then if you Google that, you're going to find the whole Olympic agenda 2020, and then also the 2020 plus 5. And in the 2020 plus 5, recommendation number 9 is that to encourage the development of virtual sports and further engage with video gaming communities. So the IOC is recognizing, one, the existence of a video gaming community, in the sense there is an audience there. We need to engage with that audience. Olympic audience maybe is getting old. People that are interested on those sports that we have in the program are getting old. We need to change the program. We included BMX, we did include surfing, we did include skateboarding, climbing, but maybe video gaming is something that we need to include. Well, they included breakdancing in the Paris program. So virtual sports might be something that we're going to see more and more and more in the future in the Olympic movement. And the person that was appointed to lead the video gaming or like the esports from the IOC on the IOC is the person who led the UCI, the cycling one on Swift. So maybe we're going to see an adaptation of that experience of cycling online into other sports, into the Olympic program. And maybe would be the way that motorsport can feature in the Olympic Games. Think like the F1 or MotoGP. So those sports are not in the Olympic Games because it involves a lot of investment to move like those cars or those motorbikes all the way from one corner of the world to the another corner to compete just in one race. It's not probably worth all the investment. You need to have like a big circuit and so on and so forth. So maybe an Olympic or like a virtual event of that will make it feasible for F1 to be in the Olympic Games and or MotoGP in the Olympic Games. So we talked about the move from gaming into esports, And maybe we can look at esports now as a business. Well, what these authors did is that, okay, there is like a growing interest in esports. There is an economic interest on esports, or people are putting money, there are more sponsors, there are more audiences. But how is that being portrayed on the press, or how this being portrayed on trade press, like say Newsweek, or like magazines that are devoted for like business people that will be like reading and watching those spaces for investments opportunities. So first we need to understand that esports have a very heterogeneous, or like a very dissimilar, very different forms of bringing money, of income generation. So it can happen via normal, that we assume, broadcasting rights. We sell like rights for other people to watch and then broadcast the event. You have like merchandising, very similar as well. We can like sell like caps and shirts, and then people like follow teams. Like streaming as well, similar to broadcasting, different like in different platforms, sponsorship deals. But there are other streams, economic income that comes from different ways. So we talk a lot about in-game microtransactions, like skin buying, that you buy skins to change your appearance in the game, or you can like bet skins. You can do like prize pools that are crowdsourced, so you have like participation of the audience. During streaming, people can like put money and give money to the streamer, and so on and so forth. So it's a very heterogeneous way of generating income. So it's very different from the traditional model, which is like probably based on broadcasting rights, sales of merchandise, maybe sales of players, and so on and so forth. If we look at esports properties, let's say you're going to buy a esports teams the same way you buy Manchester City, Manchester United. Is that the price that people are paying for those properties, for those clubs, or those teams? Is averaging 13, 14 to 1 in terms of their revenue. So that's like a premium, like really, really premium price. So in a sense, they're thinking that in the future, that will be like value a lot. So you're betting in the future. It's very similar to what people pay for startups. So like technological startups, or you can maybe link to Bitcoins as well. People are like betting that in the future that there will be a value. At the moment, it's not so much because the average price revenue ratio is like really, really high. So that they're not generating that much revenue to have that actual price. And that might be an indication of a bubble. So very similar to Bitcoin, that people are talking about, maybe that's a bubble, that like people are like paying thousands and thousands for something that has like no trade value. Very hard for you to buy something with like a Bitcoin or Ethereum or like any other of those coins. So you can see like how much money is being put into the industry. So from 2017 to 2023, there was like a 400% increase in ads and sponsorship spending in the whole world. While there is a growth in the market, there is a growth in audience, there's like more people in interest in esports, there are more people watching esports, either frequently or like occasionally. But this growth is just 64%. So we can like make two arguments here. Either is catching up with something that is already has a value, or here is kind of like a bet in future income generation. So again, very similar to startups that you invest and think that, well, maybe in the future they will bring money. They will not be a losing proposition or losing money proposition. So what they have done, check this, they collected over 16,000 news for the past like 15 years, 16 years or so in relation to esports and business and esports and investment. And what they saw, it was like a big increase on the number of reports or like the number of stories being told on esports in relation to business and investment. But which is like really important to note is that the majority of the stories nowadays focus on esports as a business investment opportunity. So that's an indication that it's becoming legitimized, is being seen as a proper industry, as a proper sport. And how they try to do this on those narratives is try to show similarities between esports and sports. And you see this on the TED Talk as well. So how much they train. It's like, oh yeah, they train a lot. And there's lots of skills. There are like lots of mental skills, like a normal athlete or like an athlete. So the use of those narratives, they make people feel that, yes, it's something worth investing. It's something that's an alternative to sport and possibly is the future of sport. And then if I'm a new entrant here and I invest this, maybe in 10 years time, that will be valued 1,000% more. So it's like buying shares from Apple in 30 years ago when no one used Apple. And now everyone has an Apple product. And then if you did that, you probably are a millionaire nowadays. So maybe it's a bet in the future. It's a very speculative investment. Bitcoin is another very similar example. And just like to finish, focusing on the cultural consumption of esports, there were like common narratives, as I said, associated with uh, violence, with like being at home, isolated, without moving, so on and so forth. So passive, dumping, or it's about like rational pleasure seeking. So you're trying like to get some pleasure out of, and you rationalize, that's the way I can do that. Or you create your identity throughout like those games and connecting to communities of gamers or like esport players. But what Brock and Johnson said in their papers, that something that was missing. There's a narrative, there's an idea that's missing about gaming and esports. And it's the notion of crafting. So it's a craft. So you need to build. So think about craft as like something that you build and then you use and then you manipulate as well. So there is lots of like activities that are part of rehearsals. So we can link rehearsal as training regimes. You're crafting a body movement. You're rehearsing a body movement that when it comes into the competition, you can like just perform without thinking. It's like natural. It becomes naturalized. Lots happen through manipulation, and manipulation one could be via those controllers. So like you manipulate like your finger, you have like dexterity. That leads to a certain output, a certain degree of agency. So all those activities show that when we are playing, we are actually creating something. You're not like only passively consuming that game, you're actually engaging with that activity to create something. And that creates something could be to be a professional esports athlete. And last slide here, where the authors look at gaming and esports as well, very similar to the idea of crafting and engaging with something, but through the lenses of social practices. So we have practices that are enacted or happen socially. So you're not like completely disassociated with a culture or if a group that does things in a similar way, very similar to sports. So you are in a group, you behave in a similar way, you play the games, you have like the way you speak about it, so like terms that you use. So there are cultural, social practices. And those practices for those authors here are into 4 levels. So like knowledge, the tools, the competencies and skills. And those happen in 3 different levels. Because when you are into esports, and then someone like wrote that in the comments on the TED Talk, so like you play, you watch, but also you govern. So like here the legitimization that I was speaking about. So there are some knowledges to play. So how you use the controller, the movements you can do. You have like the tools as well, proper tools. So if you are a professional esports player, you won't have like a normal uh, chair. You have like a proper chair. You can like buy even like IKEA. You have like gaming chairs and so on and so forth. You have like computers that are special for that, like really fast computers, low latency, and so on and so forth. You have like all the skills and competencies of playing the game. So playing is even more than just playing. It's like competing. Is an act. Is an act that's like high level performance. But for watching, it's the same thing. You have knowledge. So like, what are the rules of those competitions? So if we put like League of Legends in the big screen, would you be able to understand what's going on? So can we follow what are like the terms being used by the commentators? So you have like here they could even expand this, not only watching but like producing the event. So like commentators, do they have the competencies? Do they have like the knowledge of what's going on in that competition? What are the strategies being used by those players to win or like to try to bypass opposition? Or the whole tools you use to connect. So you need to know that on Twitch is streaming, I like internet TV. So it's not like a normal turn the TV on and watch. Things that we spoke last week about like talking to others. So the experience of the gaming or like esports is very communal. People are on the screens, they're watching on Twitch. There's a chat function in the side. People are like chatting the whole time. How different is that from watching football or watching rugby or watching any sports on TV, which is like just the game happening, and then you need to consume and do that on your other device. So there are competencies, there are skills in terms of watching. And the last one is governance. So again, how to organize the event, how to organize the international federation, and so on and so forth. And distinct from traditional sports, and maybe here we can talk about democratization again, is that esports, same individuals that play are the ones that watch. And sometimes they are the same ones that institutionalize. They are the same ones that do the governance. So different from traditional sports that we have like people like the presidents or like the CEOs of the international federations, so on and so forth, they are completely detached from the sport, detached from the players, detached from the athletes. Here we have an environment where they are all together in one big community. So maybe here's another aspect that esports teaches to sport, how get everyone together. So like fans, players, and people in the governance. So that's what I had planned to share with you today. Hopefully next week there is no storm and I will be able to come to Leeds and deliver this face to face. This week the plan is like to finish writing, I would say, your second post, and then from next week we'll move to your third post, And maybe if you're like still behind, you're still behind, but we still have like lots of time to finish everything that you need to finish for this module. So thank you. And if you want to stay